Hi everyone. I'd like to talk a little bit about sensory processing disorder with you today. Sensory processing disorder is an important disability to know about for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that in the past few years we've been discovering that more and more of the children in our care are impacted by sensory processing disorder. Additionally, sensory processing disorder is closely related to autism spectrum disorder. A lot of the material in this PowerPoint comes from that class that I teach young children with autism. And it's important to know that all children who are on the autism spectrum actually have some form of sensory processing disorder. So if you have the opportunity to work with a child with autism, you're going to encounter a lot of these symptoms and a lot of these needs that we'll be talking about today. Sensory processing disorder, or sometimes it's called sensory integration disorder, is related to problems with sensory integration. So what is sensory integration? When we're talking about this, we're talking about the neurological process of organizing sensory input through the 7 senses. So all day long, constantly, everyone is getting information from their senses, right? So the world around us is sending us all sorts of information that we're receiving through our various senses. And then that information is sent to our brain, and our brain processes that information. So sensory integration is the process of all of that information being organized constantly. It's not something that we're aware of, it's not something that we're conscious about, but it's something that's happening all the time. And you'll notice that I said 7 senses, and you may not be familiar with that. You may have only heard of the 5 senses that we normally teach children about, but there are actually 7 senses. So the first 5 are the ones that you're used to hearing about: vision, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. There are also 2 other senses that our bodies have. One is the vestibular sense, so that's our movement and balance sense. And that sense is located in the inner ear, so it has to do with all of that balance. You know, if you've ever had a really bad ear infection or an earache, you know when your vestibular sense has been thrown off. And the other sense is the proprioceptive sense, and that sense has to do with our body awareness, our sense of space around us. It has to do with our muscles and the type of input that is being given to our body through our muscles and our joints and all of the space around us. So it's a little different than touch, which often has to just do with how things feel against your skin, but proprioception actually has to do with the sense of your body in space. So sensory processing disorder. It becomes a disorder. We're talking about a disorder when a child or an individual has difficulty in processing the information that is collected through any of those 7 senses that we just talked about. Now, it's not atypical for any one individual to have a sense that's a little bit more sensitive or a little undersensitive, right? We all know someone who maybe their sense of smell is really acute and it seems they can pick up on everything, or someone that their hearing just seems to always be a little bit off, not for it to be any sort of disorder, but you always have to say their name twice before you get their attention or something like that. Well, with sensory processing disorder, we're talking about something a little bit more significant than that. We're talking about a disorder because it's impacting 2 or 3 senses at least, and it's affecting daily life. So it's not just that it's a little annoying or a little quirky, it's actually affecting a child's ability to function fully and typically within their daily life. When a child has sensory processing disorder, it's going to show up in a variety of areas. The child is likely going to have poor academic skills. The child is likely going to have poor social interactions, poor self-care skills, poor motor skills, or poor self-esteem. So it can show up in all sorts of areas of the child's life. And it's really important to know that children who have a sensory processing disorder are more likely to express challenging behaviors in the classroom. Hopefully, as you've been reading our textbook about sensory processing disorder, you've begun to see how kind of widespread the impact of sensory processing disorder can be on a child's life. And you've also begun to see how it can vary from child to child, depending on the particular senses that are impacted and other sorts of things. In this slideshow, I want to give you a little bit more information about some particulars related to SPD. So something that your textbook doesn't really cover in depth are some of these different types of sensory processing disorders. You may or may not be familiar with these, and I want to go over this table with you really quickly. So all SPDs include brain dysfunction of some type, and there are 4 different types based on 2 ideas. So the idea of a neurological threshold and the idea of a self-regulation strategy. So if you see in this table across the top, there are 2 types of self-regulation strategies, passive and active. So a child might be able to actively regulate the information that they're getting from the outside world through their senses, or they may not. They may be very passive in regulating that information. And then a child's neurological threshold for sensory information regarding one particular sense may be high or it may be low. So let's say that a child's neurological threshold for visual information is very high, right? So they can take in a lot of visual stimulus and not be overwhelmed. In fact, they are desiring a lot of visual stimulation over and over and over and over again. And if they're actively self-regulating that information, they're really seeking it. So we don't necessarily see that with vision a lot, but we do see that with movement a lot. You know, there's a child who has a high threshold for proprioceptive input, and so they are seeking movement input constantly. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Really briefly, I'm going to go over those 4 types of SPDs. So with the seeking type of SPD, this is when the child has the high threshold. They want more and more sensory input, and they are actively self-regulating. So they are seeking that sensory input. So there's normally seeking to add movement, touch, sound, visual stimulus to the world around them. If a child has this type of SPD, you're going to see these types of symptoms. They're going to be a noisemaker or fidgety. They're trying to touch everything, or they have an obsession with feeling and touching objects. They like to touch and hang on other people, so they're looking for that input. Maybe they're chewing on things, or they might have very impulsive behaviors. And here are some different strategies for a child who is a sensory seeker. And I'm just going to go over these real briefly. Your textbook has a lot of other ideas for classroom strategies for children. You might want to offer chewy and crunchy snacks or provide a water bottle to help them with that oral need for sensory input. You might provide a weighted vest or cushions or textures for a child's seat or lap, so this is giving them sensory input while they have to sit in place. You might add textures to their paints or clay. Provide gum or hard candy, provide scented lip balm, have a child help with heavy lifting tasks, do swinging and jumping exercises, plan scavenger hunts to get them moving and looking for things, or offer nature experiences. And nature is often connected with helping children experience a more calming sensation, and so that can be really helpful for these children. The opposite of seeking, you could say it's the opposite, is sensory avoiding. So a child who has an avoidance type of SPD has a low threshold for sensory input. So instead of their brain screaming, I want more, I want more, I want more, their brain is shutting down. Their brain is saying, I am overwhelmed, there's too much going on here for me, and this needs to stop. They are actively self-regulating that need, so they are active in saying, I want this to stop, and making it stop. So sensory experiences for these children are experienced as irritating or even hurtful, depending on their level of sensitivity. A child who has a sensory avoiding SPD, you're going to see resistance to sensory inputs. You're going to see that they're unwilling to participate in activities. They might dislike hugs or have eating issues. They may be very irritable, or they may be very aggressive if they're trying to really fend off these overwhelming sensory experiences. They might avoid things like baths or toothbrushing at home because those are seen as overwhelming to them. Here are some strategies for a child who's avoiding sensory input. You might want to provide this child with some space to be alone, or have the child be the door holder so that while they're standing in line, they're not having all of this input from the children around them and pushing and moving, and it's just too much. You might want to cover visual distractions or provide them with sunglasses so that lights aren't overwhelming. You could run a fan to create white noise or provide earphones so that some of that auditory stimulus isn't too overwhelming. Provide them with routines, give them warnings, offer foods with even textures, so you can see how some of these are the opposite for the seeking. Provide gloves to minimize tactile input. You can let them be okay with this idea of you can look first and touch later. You don't have to engage in a sensory experience right away. It's okay for them to just come to it on their own time in their own terms. You might want to allow a comfort item for them, and you might want to learn body brushing. This is a particular strategy that's used. It has to be specifically, you have to be kind of specifically trained in it, but it gives a child a calming sensation as it moves a lot of their basically their sense of touch, and it calms things as it moves it through their body. Low registration. So we were just talking about children who are active self-regulators. Now we're going to talk about the children who are passive self-regulators. So if a child is passively self-regulating but has a high threshold, so they need a very high degree of sensory input in order for that sensory input to register, but they're passively self-regulating. They're not looking for that degree of input, and so their brain isn't activating on enough sensory input to cue the child as to what is going on around him or her. So these children might look dull or uninterested, they might look oblivious, they might look withdrawn, they're difficult to engage, self-absorbed, easily exhausted. If a child in your care is a low registration SPD, you might want to provide materials that the child can manipulate, so that's going to activate their brain, right? Talk with varying voice intonation, that's going to activate their brain. Provide visual cues, scented lotion, a rocking chair. You can see how all of these ideas are cued to activating the child's attention and getting them to be able to cue in. Using textured paper for writing, providing heavy objects for lifting, providing colored tape to define work areas, so again visually cueing them in, adding rough or varied textures to handles, seats, work surfaces, creating opportunities for the child to play on different surfaces. So all of these are geared towards activating the child's attention, getting that brain cued into what's going on around them. A child who's sensitive, on the other hand, this is the opposite again. So now they're passively self-regulating, but they also have a very low threshold. So sensory input is overwhelming the child, but instead of actively resisting it, remember like that avoiding child, now they're just kind of passively being overwhelmed by all the information around them constantly. So these children might look hyperactive or easily distracted, easily upset. They could have very difficult time completing tasks or learning from experiences, because no matter what's going on, they're kind of bouncing from here to there and here to there and here to there, and nothing's ever really sinking in because their attention is all over the place. Strategies for a child with a sensitivity SPD, you might want to provide a buffer space, so give them some extra space around their work area. You could place sheets over a shelving area, provide earplugs, earmuffs, earphones. So these are some of the same things we might do for a child with an avoidance SPD. Provide routines, avoid placing a child near fans, serving their food in a compartment tray, giving them lap weights. That will just help them calm down a little bit. Providing even tempo music, making them a line leader or the end of the line, providing heavy lifting, having the child wear a backpack. So all of these things are helping the child to just become a little bit more centered in what they're doing, and then providing pictorial or other types of cues for instruction. So whenever we have children in our care who are demonstrating challenging behaviors, we want to consider the sensory influence. You want to pay attention to what the child is doing. Really carefully pay attention to what the child is doing. And ask yourself, is the child avoiding a sensory input, or is the child seeking a sensory input? So there are a lot of challenging behaviors that we see that if you begin to pay attention to them and look at them through the lens of the sensory integration, you begin to see them in a different way. You know, this girl right here who's doing her painting experiment on the wall. Is she just making a mess on purpose or not on purpose, or is she really seeking a sensory input? Does she need the opportunity to not just paint on this small piece of paper with her fingertips, but to engage in large body movements so that she can really experience the painting as a full body experience? So when you're adjusting challenging behaviors, be sensory aware. Use sensory supports, respect the child's emotions. It might not be overwhelming to you, but it might be very overwhelming to the child. Think of ways to prevent problems from occurring, right? Could you set up an easel instead of the small piece of paper? Now there's not paint on the wall. Be consistent with your approaches and be a researcher. Really look into what's going on for the children in your care. There are some more slides to this slideshow. I'm going to stop here with my recording. You're going to have the opportunity to look at the rest of the slides on your own to get a little bit more information about a couple specific scenarios with sensory processing disorder. Make sure you take a look at the resources section as well, so that you can continue your own learning about this important topic.